She was bound by blood to serve one vampire king, until his brothers awakened the curse that tied their hearts together. I was cursed to serve the vampire king, until his brothers claimed me too. The night they dragged Sera to the castle, the moon was a thin, trembling blade above the forest. She stumbled between two guards, her wrists bound in silver thread rope that bit through skin every time she moved. The cold stone steps loomed ahead, carved into the cliffside, each one slick with rain. The guards didn't speak, no one spoke when the king summoned a witch. They called him Alerick, the Crimson King. Sera had whispered his name 100 times in her nightmares, in the years since her curse had taken root. Her blood was bound to his will, her magic enslaved to his command. It was said he had made a pact with the goddess of night, trading his humanity for immortality and dominion. And she, foolish Sera, had once been the vessel of that goddess's light, until Alerick's magic had twisted her blessing into servitude. Now, she was being brought back to him like an offering. Inside the castle, shadows moved like sentient things. Tall windows glowed faintly with the reflected storm. Candles guttered in iron sconces, spilling gold over the marble floors veined with red. The air smelled faintly of incense and iron, blood and devotion. When the guards forced her to kneel, her heart thudded against her ribs, half fury, half fear. The throne was empty at first. Then, from the corridor beyond, footsteps echoed, measured, elegant, impossibly calm. Alerick appeared like the night taking shape, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair swept back from a face both cruel and beautiful. His eyes, impossible eyes, gleamed like garnet in the candlelight. "So," he said softly, his voice like silk over steel. "My little witch returns." Sera raised her chin despite the tremor in her hands. "I didn't come willingly." "No one ever does," Alerick replied, circling her like a predator studying prey. "But destiny is not known for asking permission." Behind him, two other figures emerged from the shadows. One wore a faint smile, his hair pale as frost and his gaze a deep, haunted blue. Damien, the scholar, the one they whispered could bend minds as easily as light. The other leaned against a column, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes burning with a quiet intensity that unsettled her more than either of his brothers. Malachi. The warrior. 3 brothers. 3 kings. Each a fragment of the same ancient curse. And Sera, bound to all of them by the spell that had destroyed her life. Alerick stopped before her, his hand lifting to brush her cheek. The touch was deceptively gentle, yet her pulse leapt as if struck. "You belong to me," he murmured. "Not anymore," she said through her teeth. His smile was a slow, dangerous thing. "Then why does your blood still sing when I'm near?" Lightning split the sky beyond the windows. In its light, she saw Damien's gaze flicker with something like pity, and Malachi's with a hunger he tried to hide. The storm outside raged on, but it was nothing compared to the one rising in Sera's chest. She had been cursed to serve the vampire king. But this time, she intended to break the curse, and maybe, just maybe, the hearts of his brothers too. They put Sera in the East Tower, a room that looked more like a reliquary than a bedroom. Books lined the walls in glass-fronted cases. A silver bowl smoldered with resin and crushed myrrh. The bed was draped in velvet the color of drying roses. Her bindings were cut, but a different tether remained, a humming at the base of her skull, a cool thread running through her veins. Alerick's mark. The curse recognized its author. A knock came like a courtesy the castle didn't owe. Damien slipped inside carrying a tray, dark tea, honey, a dish of sliced pear like an apology. Up close, he was more ghost than lord, too refined, a touch too still, yet his eyes, sea-deep, tracked every tremor in her hands. "You should drink," he said softly. The rope was laced with silver. "It leaches the heat from blood." Sera kept her back pressed to the bookcase. "What's the game, Damien?" "No game," he murmured. "Just arithmetic." We need you alive. And compliant. His mouth tilted. I prefer cooperative. It spares everyone bruises. The throne room felt like a bruise. Damien set the tray on a side table and, very deliberately, stepped back, palms open. Your warding sigils are still on the window ledge. I didn't touch them. I don't ward for you. Of course not, he said, and something like sadness moved through his gaze. You ward for yourself. I remember. He had been there the night the curse took, she remembered that much. The scholar brother, fingers ink-streaked, murmuring in a language that should have been dead, while Alerick's blood pooled in a copper bowl and Malachi stood sentinel with a sword that drank the moonlight. What do you want with me? Sera asked. Damien studied her. Truth. The curse is unraveling, and not in a way that frees you. It's fraying toward madness. Sera felt the thread in her spine tighten. Your king made this. He can unmake it. The ritual wasn't only his. Damien's hand flexed at his side, like it ached to hold a quill, to prove his words. It linked 4 lives in a braid. Yours. Alerick's. Malachi's. Mine. Her stomach dropped. A long, thin crack worked its way down her composure. No. Yes, he said. We bound ourselves to the goddess through you, to staunch a war that would have leveled this country. We paid knowing the price had been miscounted. Alerick had called it destiny. Damien called it arithmetic. Either way, Sera had been the variable they solved for, the living vessel into whom the night's power was poured. Go, she whispered. I can't, just go. Damien hesitated as if poised over a precipice. There's a library below the observatory. The door looks bricked up, but it isn't. If you can't sleep, the stars make kinder companions than we do. He left. The latch caught. His scent, paper warmed by candlelight, faded slowly. Sera didn't touch the tea. She pressed her palm to the window, to the cold breath of the storm. Somewhere in the castle, she felt Alerick like a magnetic pole. Somewhere else, thicker, quieter, a gravity that had to be Malachi. Her pulse answered all 3 in different keys. She hated that her body remembered them. She hated more the small, treacherous part of herself that was relieved they were still alive. Alerick came at dawn. He didn't knock. He never had, not even when she had been the king's shadow and her will his leash. He filled the doorway in a tailored severity of black and white, shirt open at the throat as if the storm had tried to choke him and failed. Sleep, he asked. Does your curse allow it? Sera countered. His smile didn't reach his eyes. On occasion. He crossed to the window. The rain had washed the night clean and left a bleak silver. When he turned, she saw the sentries on him, subtle but there, the way silence bent to his presence, the way air seemed to bracket itself around his breath. You were gone too long, he said, not quite accusation, not quite grief. I sent a dozen trackers. I unthreaded a dozen snare spells, she said. We're both terribly competent. He considered her, head tilted. And yet you returned. I was found. By my guards, yes. But the magic in your blood would have warned you miles before they reached you. You stayed. Alerick's gaze dropped to her hands. Why? Because there are worse monsters than vampires, Your Majesty, she said tightly. And one of them wears a bishop's ring. A line cut between his brows. The High Inquisitor. Archbishop Severin, she said, savoring the bite of the name. He's building a reliquary army. He's taking witches, cutting out our tongues, and sealing our magic into iron relics he sells as saints' bones. The corner of Alerick's jaw ticked. You ran from me and found a more exquisite cruelty. Of course. I don't need your pity. You have none, he said, gently and with terrible honesty. You have my fury. The thread between them thrummed. Sera clenched her fists until the ache replaced the hum. Alerick leaned in, close enough that the scent of him, oak casks, an orchard in the dark, nested behind her ribs. Severin has always couched his atrocities in psalms. Tell me everything. Why? So you can scorch a cathedral? Your wrath doesn't heal, Alerick. What if I promised a different end? He lifted his hand, paused, lowered it without touching her. There's a way to reweave the curse. It requires consent. Consent, she echoed, dizzy from the word on his tongue. We bound your power to ours by force. He didn't flinch. To unbind it, you would have to bind us back, willingly. All three of us. You'd carry the locus. We'd swear fealty to you instead of the night. Sera stared. You're asking me to accept a leash and call it a crown. I'm offering you a scepter, Alerick said, voice quiet and lethal. Hold it correctly and it can break every chain in this keep, including mine. The world tilted. The irony was a bitter cherry on her tongue. What's the catch? You'll be open to us, he said, eyes steady on hers. Not to our command, to our selves. Our hunger. Our faults. Our devotion. If you take us in, Sera, we will be yours entirely. And if you reject us mid-right, the backlash might kill us. And me? It will scar you, he said simply. I won't lie about that. She swallowed. The storm pressed its ear against the glass. In the hallway behind Alerick, a shadow passed, Malachi's breath, or Damien's thought. I have no reason to trust you, Sera said. You have one, Alerick replied. I want you free. Her laugh scraped. Since when? Since the night we discovered what your screams sounded like, he said, and the mask of the king cracked long enough for her to see the man who had stood in the aftermath of their ritual and despised what he had become. She felt herself sway toward him like a tide. She caught the motion and caged it. Get out, she whispered. Before I mistake wanting for wisdom. Alerick's lips parted. Then he inclined his head, court perfect. He left without argument. That rattled her worst of all. Malachi found her on the battlements that night. He moved like a mountain that had learned discretion. Armor rested easy on his shoulders, a long scar slashed through his eyebrow and vanished into his hairline, the only flamboyance he allowed. Snow flurries ghosted the air, though autumn wasn't that far gone. The castle made its own weather. You shouldn't be up here alone, he said. Planning to throw me off, General? Sera asked, blowing into her hands. If I were, I wouldn't announce it, Malachi said, and sat on the parapet beside her, the granite sighing under his weight. Planning to jump? Not right now, she said dryly. I'm cataloging the ways your brothers weaponize sincerity. His mouth did something that might one day be a smile. And me? You weaponize silence. Effective, he said. Infuriating, she corrected. They watched the forest breathe. Far below, a lantern bobbed along the outer wall. Somewhere to their left, a rook cackled to itself, pleased about secrets. You saved a boy, Malachi said, as if resuming a conversation they'd had hours ago. On the road in. Severin's men had him. Sera closed her eyes. The boy had been 12, all bones and terror, an iron tag threaded through his ear to shackle his magic. She had burned the tag out, literal fire, because one cruelty deserved another's smoke, and carried him to a hedge witch who owed her a favor. Where did you hear that? She asked. Rika told me, he said. The hedge witch you favored. You spy on your own vassals? I listen when people praise you, Malachi said, with a flatness that wasn't unkind. It's rare at court. Warmth crept under the war scar of her heart. What do you want, Malachi? To put a sword between Severin and your throat, he said. Useful, she admitted. He turned, leaned his back against the parapet, faced her fully. Alerick showed you the right? He waved it under my nose like a promise and a threat. It's both, Malachi said. We wrote it together, the three of us. It gives you teeth. It gives us a master. I don't want to master anyone. Then call it a compass, he said. We were lost before you. We were worse after. Do you think that's convincing, or simply bleak? No, Malachi said, and the nearly smile returned, this time edged with heat. Convincing would be telling you I've watched you set your jaw against pain and refuse to be small. Convincing would be telling you the night after the ritual, when you fainted, I stood at your door and swore I would never let anyone take something from you that you did not choose to give. Sera's throat tightened. The parapet felt suddenly narrow. You stood at my door? 4 hours, he said. Why? Because, he said, and looked away, out into the snow ghosting the black trees. Because I was built to stand between danger and what I can't bear to lose. You became that far too quickly. Heat rippled low in her belly, banked before it could flare. She hated how desire could braid itself with anger and feel like rope, like rescue. Fade to black, she told her own traitorous pulse, like an order to a scene she'd never let play on the page. Malachi pushed to his feet. Choose the right or don't. I will be at your door again, but this time I'll stand on the outside unless you invite me in. He left her with the snow and the rook in her wolfish heart gnawing at its tethers. The secret library below the observatory pretended to be part of the wall until Sera pulled the right book and pressed the right mortar joint. The brick shivered and folded like paper, revealing a staircase that corkscrewed into darkness. Lanterns bloomed awake as she descended. The air smelled like ink and moth wings. She found the stars first, charts upon charts, constellations annotated with prayers and curses, the paths of comets traced in copper leaf across indigo vellum. Damien stood at a long table covered in manuscripts and a disassembled astrolabe. He didn't startle. He'd known she would come. You look like a sin a monk would try to outfast, Sera said, circling the astrolabe. And you look like an omen, he replied. Good or ill, undecided. What are you mapping? The blood moon. He didn't lift his gaze from the brass and the ink. It's 3 nights away. Sera's skin prickled. And that matters because Severin will march his reliquary guards under it, Damien said. Iron carries a louder hymn when the moon is red. He'll try the castle again. Again? She asked sharply. Your absence invited his confidence, he said. He thinks the locus is lost. I'm not a lost thing, she said. No, Damien murmured. You're the home we burned to build. She went still. Don't say pretty things to me, scholar. I know what rhetoric tastes like. I'm not pretty, he said, a hint of dryness. I am exact. When we took your power into the braid, the castle stopped being a fortress and started being a body. We are all in it together now, organ, sinew, ache. Sera stared at the charts. And you want to cut the body open during a war to try a new surgery? Yes, he said. Because leaving the arteries bound the way they are will kill the heart. He finally looked up. The compassion in his face undid her more than any threat could. What do you need from me? She asked. 2 things. He held up fingers smudged with ink. Your consent to the rite. And your help finding what Severin hid here the night of the ritual. Sera frowned. He was here? Of course, Damien said. Priests love to be present at the sins they'll later condemn. What did he hide? A reliquary seed, Damien said. A kernel of sanctified iron that eats ambient magic and excretes obedience. We swept the castle and never found it. I think he nested it inside a story. Sera blinked. You want me to read the walls? You were the goddess's vessel, he said, delighted in that quiet Damien way. You know how to listen to stone. She did. It was a secret she had never told them. The world had bones, and if you pressed your ear to their hum, they told you where they hurt. Fine, she said. Move aside. She crossed to the oldest wall, not brick, but bedrock, the castle's spine. She laid her palm against it and let her breath go wide. The first thing she heard was old sorrow. Castles remember everything. The second thing was laughter tucked into mortar, children hiding in corridors during midsummer games. The third was a hymn like rust. There, she whispered, sliding her hand along the seam of 2 stones. Something hollow behind this. Damien stepped in, breath held like a priest about to break a fast. Sera scribed 3 swift glyphs in the air. The seam glowed, the rock softened. Behind it lay a niche, and in the niche, something that looked like a book made of iron, its pages welded shut. Damien swore, elegant and profane. A codex reliquary. Sera tasted metal. How do we kill it? Stories answer stories, Damien said. We'll need a countertext, written in the hand of the one it means to bind. It means to bind me, she said. So I write. We write, Damien corrected, sliding parchment toward her. You sing. I set the notes. They bent over the table, shoulders brushing without comment. Sera wrote in the language that was older than breath, older than paper, etched long ago in the hollows of God's throats. Damien mirrored her in a script that cracked iron with grammar. Hours later, the codex reliquary shivered and sighed apart. Inside, a single iron thread lay coiled like a sleeping snake. Sera pinched it in 2 with a word. When they looked at each other, her pulse was a fast animal. Damien's wasn't, he didn't have one. And still she felt it, his heartbeat in the way his gaze steadied, in the careful hush of his mouth. Fade to black, she told herself again, a talisman against heat. 3 nights, he said, voice like warm tea. Blood moon. Choose before then. I hate deadlines, she muttered. I know, he said, and surprised her with a quick, crooked smile. That's why I gave you one. The corridors of the Crimson Castle had a way of shifting when no one was looking. Sera had noticed it first in the sound. The echo of her footsteps changed, hollow one moment, muffled the next, as though the walls were breathing. Malachi had warned her not to wander alone. The house obeys only him, he'd said, gaze dark with something unspoken. Yet Alerick hadn't forbidden her from moving freely, and stubborn defiance had always been Sera's armor. She moved by candlelight now, barefoot, the hem of her nightdress whispering across stone. Somewhere behind her, faint music drifted, Damien's violin, a mournful melody that made the air ache. The library doors stood open. Inside, Damien played before the fire, his white hair loose around his shoulders, the bow moving with a lover's precision. When he saw her, the music faltered. You shouldn't be here, he murmured. Neither should you, she said. It's nearly dawn. He smiled faintly. Sleep doesn't come easily for our kind. Sera stepped closer. Because of the curse? Because of guilt, Damien said. And hunger. They're difficult to tell apart after a few centuries. He set the violin aside and looked at her, really looked. You don't realize what you've done by returning. Her heart stuttered. What do you mean? The bond has awakened again. It connects us, all of us. Even Malachi feels it. His voice dropped lower. Even Alerick. The curse is not only yours to bear. She swallowed hard. Then why do I still feel like your prisoner? Damien rose, closing the distance between them. Because you haven't yet decided if you want to be free. For a long, dangerous moment, neither of them moved. Then a voice broke the silence, deep and sharp as a blade. Step away from her. Alerick stood in the doorway, his presence swallowing the room's warmth. His crimson eyes flicked to Sera, then to Damien, full of something that might have been jealousy, if monsters could feel such things. Sera turned on him. I'm not yours to command. Alerick's jaw tightened. You are mine until the curse is broken. Then help me break it, she said, her voice trembling with fury and something else, hope. His gaze softened, just for an instant. You don't understand what that would cost. Then explain it to me. He didn't. Instead, he stepped forward, close enough that she felt the cold of him against her skin. The air between them shimmered with unspoken history, a tether she couldn't sever no matter how much she wanted to. Malachi appeared then, silent as a shadow. Enough, he said. The witch is exhausted. Let her rest. Sera turned to him, startled by the protectiveness in his tone. Alerick hesitated, then nodded once. Tomorrow, he said, you'll see what binds us all. And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall like the beating of a dying heart. Sleep did not come easily. Sera dreamed of blood and starlight, of hands reaching for her through a sea of mist. When she woke, dawn was only a gray smudge against the windows. Someone had left a black rose on her pillow. Its petals shimmered faintly with silver runes, ancient vampire sigils of possession. She crushed it in her hand. Down in the courtyard, she found Malachi training. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, the blade in his hand slicing the air like a hymn. When he noticed her, he lowered the sword, breathing hard. You shouldn't be awake, he said. I could say the same. He gave a rough laugh. Vampires don't rest. We remember. What do you remember, Malachi? She asked. He studied her for a moment. You. Before all this. Before Alerick bound you. The words hit her like a blow. You knew me. I loved you, he said quietly. We both did. That's why he cursed us all. Her pulse thundered. You're saying this curse isn't punishment for me, it's punishment for you? Malachi's gaze dropped. We tried to save you from him. We failed. The goddess bound all our souls together as penance. You became the key. Sera stepped back, shaking her head. No. No, you're lying. He sheathed his sword. Then tell me why your magic responds to all three of us. Tell me why your heartbeat falters every time one of us touches you. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Because deep down, she already knew. The curse wasn't a chain. It was a bond. One forged from love twisted by betrayal. And somewhere in the center of it all waited the truth, terrible and divine. By dawn, the castle had exhaled the last of the storm. Sera dressed in silence, palms pressed to the windowsill as the sky bruised from violet to rose. She'd slept little, sleep had edges that cut when she turned. Every time she closed her eyes she saw three faces, Alerick's carved restraint, Damien's aching patience, Malachi's silent plea, and behind them, something older, a woman-shaped radiance with a mouth of stars and a gaze like the cold center of a flame. The corridors were cool and damp, the stone sweating out the night. She followed the pulse under the floors, her pulse echoed through the castle's bones, to the winter garden. Once, this had been a courtyard of frost lilies and silver yew. Now vines slick with dew climbed broken trellises and reached toward a tangle of cloud. Alerick stood where the fountain had cracked years ago. Water had found a stubborn way out. A thin thread curled from the wound and fell in fractional drops. You came, he said, as if there'd been any doubt. Twice now you've said I don't understand the cost, Sera told him, stepping onto the wide ring of marble that used to frame the fountain. Show me. No more pretty words. The king took a patient breath. For an instant, the mask slipped and she saw the tired man beneath, something human straining under centuries of deliberate control. Words aren't pretty when they are true, he said, then lifted a hand and the broken fountain opened like an eye. Light crawled up through fissures in the stone, a memory old enough to be a scar. Sera felt the air change. She saw herself, not this body, exactly, but a shape that contained the same stubbornness and the same too-tender heart. She was veiled in moonfire, bare feet marking runes into sand. Around her stood the three brothers, younger and unblooded by regret. A vow braided the four of them together: protect the vessel, protect the world she steadies by existing. She tasted vanilla and iron. She heard her own voice, a bellstroke in a wide night: I'm not a vessel. I'm a person. The memory snapped forward like a trap. A temple blazing. Mortal hands reaching, greedy for the light. Alerick, reckless, incandescent, leapt to shield her. Damien bled from the brow where a priest had cut him to take a lock of God-touched hair. Malachi broke a door with his body and carried her through smoke that tasted like burned prayer. The goddess's attention turned, slow and huge. Sera's stomach dropped. This is the night I died, she whispered. Alerick closed his eyes. It was supposed to be a passing, your light back to her, your human life released. But mortals had interfered, and gods prefer clean math. How am I here? You begged, he said, voice the faintest fracture. Not to live, never for yourself. His gaze found hers, the garnet sheen in his irises damped to something like wine. You begged to stay so your light wouldn't become an instrument. So the goddess couldn't seed it into a warlord's child or a zealot's pilgrim. You asked to remain where we knew you, where we could hold you until the world stopped asking for a weapon. So you bound me, Sera said, the words brittle. You made chains out of vows. We made a bridge out of a fall, Alerick answered. Chains are what it felt like when fear grew around it. She had no answer ready. The memory had left a taste in her mouth like juniper and grief. She could feel the imprint of 3 hands over her heart, one calloused, one ink-stained, one cold and steady, and the fourth, her own, pressed on top to hold them there. It wasn't consent as she understood it. It wasn't captivity either. It was a decision made while bleeding and burning and terrified. She wanted to be furious. A part of her was. Another part understood the messy ways people love when they are cornered by time. Make me a promise, she said finally. From here on, nothing without my yes. Alerick's shoulders eased. He came close enough that the chill of his breath raised the hairs on her forearms. I would carve it into my bones. She didn't flinch. Don't carve. Live it. He bowed, a small, private gesture, and when he straightened his mouth had that restrained softness he let her see when caution failed. Then live it with us, he said quietly. Let us learn you again. Not the vessel. You. She left him with the fountain's wounds slowly weeping new water and the bruised sky mending itself to morning. Behind her, the wintered garden smelled less like chilled rot and more like first rain. The chapel was a narrow rib cage of stone, the ceiling painted with a night sky unmoored from any season. Every star had a name in a language Sera only remembered when she forgot to be afraid. Damien knelt before the candles and matched his breathing to the tiny flames until the clamor in his head went quiet. Sera slid into the pew behind him. You always did like talking to small lights, she said, surprising herself with the familiarity. He turned, surprise enlarging his pupils. And you always scolded me that fire listens only to itself. I don't remember saying that, she admitted. But I feel the shape of having said it. Memory is a tide, Damien murmured. Better to float than to drown in it. She came down the aisle and sat beside him. Up close, the pale fall of his hair carried the faintest scent of old paper and rosemary. A scholar's perfume. A relic of human days he'd chosen to keep. Alerick showed me, she said. The temple. The vow. Damien lowered his eyes. Did you hate us for it? I'm not finished feeling about it. She folded her hands as if in prayer and looked at their fit. But this, right here? You waiting out your mind next to a wall of tiny suns? This is honest. I can hold this without it cutting me. He laughed softly. Honesty is the only thing I have left that won't turn to ash in my mouth. He considered her. You're looking for the edges, Sera. Where we end and you begin. And where choice lives between. He hummed assent. After a moment he reached into his coat and produced a folded scrap of vellum, edges gone furred with handling. He offered it. I meant to give you this a lifetime ago. Or yesterday. Time is inconvenient. She opened it. Her handwriting, hers, undeniably, spooled across the page in loops like music notation. A list. Not holy at all. Things I will do when this is over: eat apricots until sick, swim at midnight, listen for owls, tell Damien that silence is not a virtue, make Malachi touch the sea, steal Alerick's crown and fill it with wildflowers, keep my name, no matter what shape light takes. You kept this, she said, throat tight. Every version of you writes a list, Damien said. You're remarkably consistent in your rebellions. He bumped his shoulder against hers in a tentative, human gesture. We can start now. The apricot merchant still sets up at the night market below the eastern gate. The sea is farther. The crown is, his mouth tilted. Within reach. She let her head tip to his shoulder and stared at the errant stars painted overhead. I don't want to be brave only when burning, she said. I want a quiet bravery. The kind that steals someone's crown and uses it for flowers. You taught me that kind, he said. You just forgot you were the teacher. The chapel's candles guttered as a draft found them and then steadied. Damien held himself very still to give Sera a place to rest. When she lifted her head, his eyes were luminous with the relief of being asked to stay. Tell me the rest, she said. The part you think Alerick would tie up in shadows. He didn't hesitate. When the awakening comes again, the goddess presses your boundaries to remake you into something that won't need us. That pressure will crack anything brittle. So we can't be brittle. We can't be a cage you break. We have to be a harbor you choose. Sera folded the list and slid it over her heart. Then help me build it, she said. Help me make a harbor. Damien blew out a candle and the chapel dimmed, gentling the painted night to something less ornate and more true. Start with this, he said, voice low. Stay tonight. Not as penance. As practice. She stayed while dawn leaked into the seams of the door. They did not touch beyond the careful brace of shoulders, but the nearness sang like a promise that understood the value of waiting. Malachi was not where anyone said he'd be. The training yard was empty, swords asleep in the racks. She found him instead on the highest balcony, where wind had a habit of telling the truth and the horizon sprawled like a patient animal. He stood with his hands on the balustrade. The posture turned his body into a supplication he'd never voice. He didn't turn when she came near. He felt her the way mountains feel weather. You were going to leave, Sera said, because the wind told her and because in all their lives she had learned that naming a thing takes its teeth. Malachi's fingers tightened on stone already grooved by centuries of this same grip. If I leave first, I don't have to be left, he said, the smallest wryness in it, as if he knew the line was thin armor and wore it anyway. She stepped in beside him, hip to hip with the railing. Up here the air smelled like snow even though the plain below was a damp thaw. You could go, she said. You've done harder things. You once walked into a burning temple to carry me out. I did that because you told me to be useful, he said. I have been misapplying the instruction ever since. Sera huffed. It was nearly a laugh. Then let me revise the order. She turned and leaned her back against the balustrade so she could look at him. Be here. You don't owe me that kindness. It isn't kindness, she said, fierce without raising her voice. It's a request. Stay. Not because everything is simple. Precisely because it isn't. He finally turned. His eyes were a night with weather in it. If I stay, I'll want you, Sera. More than is easy to swallow. I'm not asking you to swallow anything, she said, then smiled crookedly. Except maybe apricots later. The smallest crack found his careful austerity. Damien gave you the list. He did. She held the wind-snarled gaze without flinching. And I want the part where you touch the sea. I don't like the sea, Malachi said, half automatic. You don't like anything you can't punch into sense. He made a tired sound that might have been a choked laugh. Quietly, like it might spook, she set her knuckles against his bare forearm. You carried me through fire, she said. I am asking you to let me carry some of this now. Malachi's throat worked. He covered her hand with his much larger one. The contact hit like the shock of stepping into a cold river on purpose. Not pain, clarity. Their bond thrummed, not as a yoke but as resonance, the way instruments hum to a neighbor's note. It would be so easy to fall into the old shortcut, power rising, mouths finding each other, the bond snatching consent out of them like a current. Sera shut her eyes and eased the magic down until it panted instead of sprinted. When she opened them, Malachi was already watching her like she'd done something that mattered. Thank you, he said, voice rough. For choosing to stop. Not stop, she corrected. Slow. So when we move, it's because we meant to. They stood until the wind admitted it couldn't move them. When Malachi finally spoke again, it had the texture of an oath. I'll stay, he said. And when you ask me to touch the sea, I'll do it ugly. I can't promise grace. Bring the ugliness, Sera said. I'll pack the apricots. Below them, a gate creaked. Somewhere a bell marked an hour and the castle answered like a sleeping thing adjusting to new breathing. The balcony seemed to widen to fit the four of them the way it once had, a place with room enough for weather and wanting. The castle yielded a seasonal room no one had entered in a century. Dust lifted like benediction when Sera pushed open the warped door. It was a narrow chamber with a wide stone window seat looking onto the eastern valley, a hearth built too small for the grand logs in the great hall and just right for the armful of branches she dragged from a forgotten alcove. They lit the fire together that evening, Damien arranging the kindling with librarian's precision, Malachi crouched to strike flint, Alerick standing back and letting the small domesticity unmake him in quiet ways. Sera placed a dented kettle on a trivet and dried apricots on a plate scavenged from a closet of antique ghosts. This was your room, Damien said, fingers grazing the carved lintel where someone, her, had once scratched constellations with a pin. Or one of the U's. Feels good, Sera said simply. They did not sit in a neat line. They scattered in the room like dropped stars, Malachi on the floor, back against the bed frame, Damien with one hip on the window seat, knees drawn up, Alerick leaning on the mantel, palms flat on stone as if warming his hands hurt. Sera took the rug in the middle and pulled her legs under, the kettle beginning to sing. The conversation unfurled with the slow bravery of bodies learning a new weather. They told small truths, what they kept that used to be human, Damien's fondness for the smear of graphite on his fingers after writing, Malachi's habit of polishing his boots with beeswax because the smell made him think of orchards, Alerick's night walks ending at the servants' corridor where bread cooled, and let those truths invite bigger ones. Say it plainly, Sera said at last, because the room could hold it. What do you want from me? Not the goddess. Not the bond. You. Alerick's jaw flexed. He went first because he was the most practiced at going last. I want to be forgiven for the shape I made love take, he said. I want, not absolution. To practice a gentler form until it becomes my only fluency. His mouth softened. And I want to see you wear my crown full of weeds. Damien smiled into his knees. I want to be permitted to be foolish, he said. To want without turning the wanting into a philosophy. He looked at her. I want to hear you laugh when you mean it. Malachi didn't look at the fire or at anyone else, he looked only at her. I want to stand between you and things that bruise, he said. And I want to learn to stand beside you even when my fear says to block the hit with my body. Sera let the wanting move through her like weather without trying to trap it in jars. I want, she said carefully, to be greedy with you three. Greedy for quiet mornings and ugly crying and the petty fight about who used the last candle stub and the way your faces soften when I remember something you thought you'd lost. I want to be held without becoming a relic. I want to love you like a mortal, finite and ferocious. Greedy is allowed, Damien said, eyes bright. Alerick's laugh was hardly a sound. Malachi's exhale carried a prayer he didn't intend to speak. The kettle found its shrill and Sera poured cups with hands that shook the smallest bit. She brushed Alerick's wrist as she passed his and the bond rose, impatient. She didn't fight it, she directed it, the way one coaxes a horse to a walk from a jittery canter. She set her cup down and reached out, one hand to Damien's, one to Malachi's, then tipped her chin toward Alerick. He joined them without being asked twice. Their circle was not ceremonial. It was domestic and holy anyway. Magic threaded fingertip to wrist to palm, pausing at the doorways of skin to ask and then slipping through with a relief that felt like the first deep breath after being held under. Heat rose, a kind that had little to do with the hearth. Sera felt the old rhythm, the one that had, in other lives, pulled four bodies into a tangle made of heat and wanting and the clean consent of long practice. She let it hum and then, when it tried to carry them too fast, she pressed her hand to the floor and grounded it. Stay, she whispered, not a command to the magic. To themselves. They did. It was harder than surrendering. It made room for all the parts that had nothing to do with slick skin and bitten gasps, the way Malachi's hand shook and steadied under hers, the way Damien's smile went lopsided when he was relieved, the way Alerick's lashes quivered when he let people see he felt. When they finally rose from the floor, nothing explosive had happened and everything had. The room was warmer. The apricots tasted like summer stolen from the future. And the crown. Alerick had brought it on a whim and left it on the chair, really did look like a bowl meant for wildflowers. Tomorrow, Sera said, holding the ridiculous thing. We pick weeds. Tomorrow, Alerick said, voice salt-soft. And the day after, Damien added, reckless as any scholar who's forgotten his fear. Malachi reached for the crown and set it on her head where it sat a little crooked. And the day after, he said, like a vow retrained into something that doesn't bruise. The first moon after the storm rose fat and clean. Sera knew it before she looked, the way a violinist knows the exact height of a note before the bow touches string. The awakening didn't arrive as catastrophe this time. It came as pressure from within, urging her bones to loosen so light could sit between them. They met in the great hall because old magic likes old rooms. The circle was chalk and salt this time, not blood. The sigils were ones Sera traced from memory the way a child traces her own palm, slowly, lovingly, not to invoke a god but to remember herself. She wore linen and no shoes. The brothers wore what they always did when something volatile might happen, Alerick in that kind of quiet that makes a battlefield pause, Damien with his sleeves rolled as if to shelve a heavy book, Malachi in leathers that had seen both prayer and war. You don't have to do this alone, Alerick said, as if she might reach for the solitary path out of habit. I know, Sera said. That's why I can. Damien set 3 small bowls at the quarter points, honey, salt, clean water. Malachi checked the doors without appearing to check them at all. Sera stood in the center and breathed until her body remembered itself as a room with windows. When the light pressed, she didn't grit her teeth. She greeted it, I see you. It pushed back the way an ocean does on ankles, implacable because it is itself. She didn't try to be bigger. She made herself porous. The light flooded, and the places that might once have cracked in her did not. There was space because she'd made it. The goddess's voice didn't split the air. It arrived as a knowing, like recognizing your own handwriting. Beloved, it said. Sera set her feet wider. I've heard you call me many things. She said it aloud so the men who loved her could hear courage spoken in a mortal voice. Here are my names now: Sera. Witch. Lover. Greedy. Finite. The light pulsed, amused maybe. You are mine. I'll never be a weapon, Sera answered. And I won't be an altar either. She lifted her hands and the brothers came to her without being summoned. They took positions not as guardians around a precious center but as parts of a shape designed for sharing. Alerick at her right shoulder, Damien at her left, Malachi behind, his palms a steady heat at the small of her back. Consent didn't have to be voiced. They'd spent weeks practicing it in touches refused and accepted, in pauses honored, in laughter that unhooked old reflexes. But they said it anyway, each in their way. Yes, Alerick said, a vow softened with humility. Yes, Damien said, a prayer relieved of its fear. Yes, Malachi said, an oath that did not close like a fist. The light swelled. The hall brightened until the edges of stone blurred through white. Sera could feel the exact point where their magic met hers and became something fourth. Not her becoming a god. Not them becoming anything monstrous. A communion as simple as breath passed between mouths in the dark. Share, then, the goddess murmured, not pleased or displeased, only curious as whether. Sera let it. Each of the brothers took a strand of what burned inside her, not siphoned, not stolen, received like bread from a table where there would always be more. It hurt the way growth hurts. It soothed the way being held by something that knows your weight does. Where the vow had once made chains, choice made bridges. The light didn't have to be damned. It could be lived in. When it ended, it did not end. The magic stopped pressing like a storm front and settled like a climate. The windows didn't blow out. The circle didn't scorch. Sera's knees didn't buckle. Her body had practiced standing in this weather. Alerick leaned his forehead to hers for one long breath. Damien made a sound he had never permitted himself to make, a joyful, astonished thing, sharp as a gasp. Malachi's hand stayed steady at her back until the tremor left her. Did we? Damien couldn't finish the sentence, too human in his hope. Sera smiled, truly smiled, delighted and undone. We lived, she said. And I think we will go on living. Alerick's laugh broke in the middle. Malachi exhaled like he'd been holding the castle on his shoulders and could finally set it down. The days that followed did not turn into a poem. They turned into a life. The dawn after the ritual, Sera put on boots and led 3 vampires into the scrubby field beyond the south wall with a pair of shears and a basket. The weeds were belligerent and perfect, Queen Anne's lace, burrs that clung to Malachi's trousers with erotic insistence, a feral clutch of pinks laughing at the fence. They filled the basket until Alerick stood in the morning sun wearing his own crown loaded with meadow. You're ridiculous, Sera told him, delighted. So I have been accused, he said gravely, and didn't remove it when a kitchen maid came through the gate and burst into surprised laughter. He bowed to her, ridiculous on purpose, to give her a story to tell. Damien took her to the night market and bought her apricots, and when she made herself sick from sweetness as promised, he held her hair back and read a recipe for a stomach-soothing tea like it was a love poem. Malachi went to the sea under explicit protest. It was a raw day, the horizon a tarnished blade. He stood ankle-deep and glared at the indifferent gray. Sera came up beside him wordlessly, let the foam chill her shins, then reached down and splashed him so thoroughly it soaked his scowl off. He sloshed back, of course. Later, wet and swearing and laughing, they sat on a rock and ate bread with their cold hands. Malachi admitted the sea didn't need his forgiveness to keep being good. On a wet noon Alerick found Sera in the little seasonal room sewing a belt loop back onto Malachi's trousers with an obstinate thread. He leaned in the doorway and watched her domestic war like a man seeing a saint break bread. She felt the heat of his gaze eventually and lifted her eyes. You're staring, she said. Learned behavior, he replied. I used to count your breaths to convince myself I hadn't dreamed you. She set the trousers aside and patted the bed. He came obediently and stretched full length on his side, a king making himself small enough to fit in a mortal's afternoon. She traced the line of his throat, the shadow where a pulse might once have lived. He caught her hand, kissed the heel of her palm. The wanting rose. It was not a cathedral. It was a room with windows. They leaned toward each other and then, as if by unspoken agreement, stopped. Not because we mustn't, Alerick said against her wrist. No, Sera answered. Because it's sweeter to wait another hour. Another night. Because we can. Later, with rain its own kind of privacy on the window, she lay between Damien and Malachi under a heap of mended quilts, the three of them arranged like a sentence with no one trying to be the period. They told small stories into the dim, the worst joke each had ever heard, the first thing they'd stolen and why, the tenderest lie someone had once told them, and the day they understood it had been kindness, not deceit. When sleep came, it was not a surrender or an ambush. It was a choice made together. The castle changed its habits to fit them. Rooms warmed where her feet went often. Corridors quit moving when Malachi asked with a hand on the wall. The chapel's star ceiling faded in exactly the spot where Damien always leaned his head. Sera thought it was the paint surrendering to the press of a life. In the winter garden, the wound in the fountain sealed itself around a coin Sera had thrown in because she could. Alerick pretended coins had never once been beneath his dignity. Not everything was soft. Grief doesn't vanish because joy is permitted. Sera still woke some nights and pressed her hands to her ribs to make sure her body wasn't being hollowed to make room for someone else's idea of holiness. Damien still left rooms too quickly when laughter grew too loud. Old fear told him joy was a prelude to an order. Malachi still walked the perimeter at midnight, counting threats invisible to anyone less practiced in catastrophe. But now there was language for the hard. Now there were pauses that meant I hear you and hands that meant do you want to be touched or only witnessed? And the courage to accept witnessed as an answer. On an evening the world spent its last light in a ridiculous pink, Sera set a table on the balcony where Malachi had once tried to learn leaving first. She brewed a tea that tasted like the inside of a honeycomb and the first clean page of a notebook. She placed the crown in the middle full of weeds gone to seed. The wind came to listen. To greedy, she said, lifting her cup. To finite, Damien added, smiling like he'd finally forgiven time for moving. To staying, Malachi said, and didn't look ashamed that his voice scraped. Alerick lifted his cup last. To consent, he said, solemn and joyful both. To love becoming its gentlest fluency. They drank. Sera set her cup down and looked at her life. 3 men who were not gods to her and never would be again, a castle that understood it was a house, a magic that felt like warm water instead of a tide ripping at its shore. She felt the goddess in the way a well remembers rain, not as a voice to obey, but as a cyclical truth. Light returns. So does dark. The work is not to bar the doors. It is to keep building windows. When the first stars took their places, Sera reached for Alerick's hand and then for Damien's and then for Malachi's, and they let their fingers find their fits. The bond thrummed, not summoning or compelling, just pleased to be used like a road between familiar rooms. Tell me a future, she said. Damien went first because he was usually last. Tomorrow we buy apricots and don't get sick. Malachi huffed. Unrealistic. Tomorrow I talk to the blacksmith about hinges that don't squeal and you two waste coin on fruit. Alerick watched them with the kind of fondness that, if left unattended, becomes worship. He kept it tended. Next week, he said, we remove the last of the old sigils from the servants' passage. I'd like the house to stop thinking fear is part of the architecture. Sera closed her eyes. In the growing dark, their hands were 3 small suns around hers. And when the light presses again, she said, we share it before it hurts. Yes, Alerick said. Yes, Damien said. Yes, Malachi said. They didn't kiss then, though it would have been a perfect ending. They didn't disappear into the kind of heat that fades taste from the mouth. They stayed on the balcony, drinking the last of the honey tea while night tested its new shape around them. After a while, Sera reached for the crown and settled it on her own head. It shed seeds when she laughed. Somewhere below, a kitchen maid looked up at the balcony and saw a queen of weeds and 3 men in love with the way she had chosen to live. That night the story that went around the market wasn't about a vampire king who drank the moon. It was about a woman who turned a crown into a garden and made a house remember it had windows. The awakening came again weeks later, shy and ordinary as a tide. It didn't even deserve a chapter. Sera opened her hands. They shared the light and then went down to the kitchen and ate bread warm from the oven, butter glossing their fingers. Alerick burned his tongue and pretended he hadn't. Damien found a crumb in the shape of a star and pocketed it for reasons even he didn't understand. Malachi leaned on the doorframe and let the smell of yeast erase one of the worst nights from his head. Peace after chaos is not a miracle. It's a practice. They kept practicing. And the castle, reborn in light it could wear without cracking, told the weather to behave. Sometimes it did. When it didn't, there were 4 people under one roof who could open a window together and let the wind see itself out. Epilogue. The castle had forgotten how to sleep quietly. Its new heart, the 4 of them, beat too loudly for that. Some nights, its stones thrummed with laughter from the winter garden or the clatter of Malachi dropping his training blades where they didn't belong. Other nights, the silence itself felt awake, full of the soft sound of quills scratching, pages turning, and the steady hush of a kettle boiling long after midnight. Sera walked those halls barefoot, every corridor lit only as far as she needed it. Her magic no longer pressed at her ribs like a captive thing, it lived inside her like breath, quiet, essential, hers. She passed Alerick asleep at the hearth, his crown forgotten on the floor beside a pile of wilted flowers. Damien had fallen asleep on a couch with a book open against his chest, a single candle guttering low beside him. Malachi leaned in the doorway, as if guarding them all, but his eyes were half closed and his sword leaned against the wall, dustless for once. Sera smiled. Not the weary kind that came after surviving, but the kind that came from belonging. The wind carried the scent of the sea even this far inland. It smelled like beginnings. She looked out through the tall windows, the same ones that once watched her curse take root, and saw the moon reflected in every pool, every window pane, every drop of dew on the garden. Not a goddess's symbol anymore. Just light, shared freely. Finally, she whispered to the night, "We're home." Behind her, 3 voices murmured in sleep, one sigh, one wordless hum, one soft, "Sera." The castle settled. The world turned. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the dawn rose without demand or prophecy, only promise. The end.